we can't always approach these stories from the past with like our modern understanding. And we have to be really humble about like how uncertain knowledge is.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today, we're speaking with Michael Denham. Michael is a medical student at Columbia University. He received his master's in philosophy from the University of Cambridge in health, medicine, and society. He wrote a prize-winning dissertation titled Bloodlust, a case study of Theranos and the embodiment of the brand's values in a chief executive. He's written for Nautilus before about being a medical student during the pandemic when in-person learning got shut down. That was titled, You Can't Dissect a Virtual Cadaver. But Michael is joining us today to talk about his recent story in Nautilus, titled When the Surgeon Was an Uneducated Barber. A medical student confronts the history of surgery. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Awesome. Before we dive into your piece, do you want to give us a brief background on how you got interested in writing?
Sure. So I think the first profession that I ever had interest in was writing. I was an avid reader growing up, and I used to write stories for some of my classes that I would read to everyone. And I think fiction was probably the big thing I was interested in for quite a long time. And then once I came to medical school, I realized that there were so many stories that I was seeing every day. And that was one of the things that made me want to go to medical school in the first place, the ability to interact with people in some of those their most like vulnerable states in intimate settings. And there's a lot of really rich storytelling that can come from that. And so I gradually became more and more involved in the narrative medicine department here at Columbia, and specifically started getting involved in this narrative medicine journalism workshop. And so started working more and more on nonfiction writing through that venue. And ultimately that led me to my first article with Nautilus. And I was really excited to be able to write another piece for y'all.
Yeah, want to give us a brief summary of your latest piece for anyone who hasn't read it yet?
Sure. So the piece is a discussion of the history of surgery. It specifically looks at the history of surgery through 3 books that have been published recently. One is kind of a broad history of surgery that was written by Ira Rutko. And he is both a surgeon and a historian. And he goes all the way from the kind of Stone Age evidence of surgery to the modern day. And then there's another book called Spare Parts, which is specifically focusing on transplant surgery. And that's by Paul Craddock. And quite an interesting read. It focuses, again, on transplant surgery in particular, but starts out kind of with rhinoplasties and then walks you through some of the major developments up to modern day and takes a look a little bit at where transplant surgery could head in the future. The final book that I discuss is called The Facemaker by Lindsay Fitzharris. And that one is probably the narrowest focus of the 3, focuses on a surgeon by the name of Harold Gillies, who is from New Zealand, but practiced primarily in the UK. Specifically around the time of World War I, he started doing a lot of reconstructive facial plastic surgery. He was an otolaryngologist or an ENT by training, and he was known for being someone who pulled in people from a ton of different professions to try and tackle the problem of how do you reconstruct soldiers' faces after they have truly traumatizing injuries coming back from the war. And so he would bring together sculptors, painters, photographers, as well as dentists and other people from the medical profession. And that collaboration was really key to kind of ushering forth this era of facial plastic surgery. And so I used the moment of those 3 books being published within a relatively short time period to reflect on my own experience in my training in medical school on my surgical rotation, which is usually the first time where med students get an intensive opportunity to be in the operating room, to get to assist in surgeries, to learn directly from the surgeons and the other members of the surgical team. And uh, having that kind of like privilege, like being able to enter that space, because it is a privileged space, um, made me want to reflect on how like the history has led to everything and everyone being in that room doing those things in that moment. And so I was really grateful for Nautilus giving me the opportunity to talk about that in the piece.
What was the most appealing aspect of getting to write the story?
I think it was probably getting a chance to talk with some of the authors. Um, I had some really rich conversations with both Paul Craddock and Ira Retko. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to talk with Lindsay Fitzharris as she was in the middle of quite a big book tour. So her book has taken off after publication. But I was able to chat with them for quite a while about their opinions on some of the things that they wrote about, get their insights for some things that maybe were off the page. I remember talking with Paul Craddock about some of the things that didn't make it in the story. And it was actually quite interesting. He told me this lengthy story that he found doing research for the book that he was planning on constructing the entire book around. And he eventually decided that, no, I have to scrap that because it's a little too far removed from transplant surgery directly. And so getting insight with the authors directly, I think, was one of the most exciting parts, because it allowed me an opportunity to kind of look behind the curtain at some of that writing for those longer nonfiction pieces.
What were your first thoughts on how to go about reporting the story?
I think so. There were two sides to reporting that I really wanted to make sure that I tackled well. First is I wanted to do the books and their authors justice, which required close reading of the books and also making sure that I did my research beforehand, before those interviews with all of the authors. Um, and I think ultimately that paid off in terms of having a very rich set of discussions with them. I also think there's this other side of I had to actively reflect on what my own experiences were within my medical training, within the operating room specifically, because there were a variety of cases that I could talk about and reflect on. Um, and I had to specifically kind of go through all of those and see what would be the most vivid or the most interesting, not just to me, but to someone maybe who has never stepped foot in an operating room. Um, and so that process of like self-reflection and trying to make sure that I'm pulling out the stories that may be the most salient, even for people who haven't interacted with medicine or surgery too much directly. Uh, I think those were some of my big concerns in making sure that I did the reporting. Also, in uh, like doing this kind of historically focused piece, I really wanted to make sure that I got that historical discussion correctly. There's a specific way of reporting about and talking about history that I think you have to be very deliberate. You have to make sure that the dates get right, which requires lots of fact checking, not just with the sources that you're reading, because ultimately they're pulling from many different primary sources as well. And so I wanted to kind of go beyond those three books directly and make sure that the stuff I was discussing um, was done accurately and, like I had said, deliberately. So, and I think some of that came from my ability to, or like the training that I got during the master's, which involved, among some other fields, some historical training. And I was definitely reflecting on that as I was trying to write this, 2,500 word piece about history.
If I may, I'd like to read your opening section. And for those of you who haven't read the piece yet, this might entice you a bit. So Michael starts off by saying, "Come here," the vascular surgeon told me during a lull in activity. I stepped closer. "Put your hands where mine is." I burrowed my hand into the open abdomen, my wrist sliding past a mess of slippery intestines that occasionally contracted with a wave of peristalsis. "You feel that?" he asked me. I nodded as a strong, steady pulse pushed against my fingers. "That's the aorta." So, do you want to tell us a little more about that moment and give us a little more context to how you came to the idea of using that as your opening?
Sure. So, in looking back at my experience on my surgical rotation, I think it was maybe 5 or 6 weeks throughout our main year of medical training that we spend specifically on like a general surgery service. And I was primarily on a laparoscopic service, which is basically where you use small openings to access the abdomen. And usually those surgeries were bariatric, so weight loss surgeries, or maybe hernia repairs. So some opening in the tissue that leads to a hernia that needs to get fixed. And every Friday, we had an opportunity to go on a different service. And so I had a chance to look at the colorectal service. I had a chance to go on the vascular service. And in reflecting on what were some of the kind of most memorable moments for me from my surgical rotation, I think the day that I spent with the vascular surgeons was probably one of the most salient. One, it was one of the longer surgeries that I attended. It was supposed to be like kind of a, maybe like a 6, 7 hour thing, and it ended up getting shortened. But I specifically remembered doing a couple hours of prep. There's this long incision that goes down the abdomen, which takes time to do the incision, but also to like to open up after and to kind of get your bearings. So much in surgery is about getting your bearings and finding what they call your planes, because you want to make sure that you know where you are, you know where you're poking. You don't want to mess with a blood vessel that could be something really important. So you want to make sure to identify the blood vessel, see where it's going, using your anatomical knowledge before you start messing around haphazardly. And I remember there was all this prep leading to this moment where we were searching in the abdomen, and there was kind of this pause within the surgery, which was ultimately them getting concerned about like something that would have required them to stop the surgery. And the surgeon talked to me and was like, "Oh, you want to feel the aorta?" And so I came close, and I remember feeling the pulse against my fingers. And it was honestly just one of the kind of most, I mean, I said most salient, but like, it's so strange to feel the blood going through what's arguably the most important vessel in the body and know that you're in contact in some sort of fashion with like the life force, the energy that's fueling this person's existence in that moment. There's also a real humility to that, because this person is in a way like flayed open in front of you, and their entire life, their ability to walk out of that room eventually to you and the other members of your team. And I remember feeling all of that in that moment. And it was really startling, because there are some moments that I think within medical training that stick with you, that make you think, kind of remember why you went into medicine in the first place, and what were some of the things that, at the end of the day, when you're falling asleep, that stay in your mind and that you toss around in your brain because they feel really important and they feel really meaningful, and you don't always know what to do with that. And I didn't necessarily, when thinking about this story, know what to do with that anecdote, but I felt like there was something to it there. And ultimately, that desire to be curious about that story led me to want to write about it and to use it as the intro to this piece.
Are there any bits from the story when you were drafting it that didn't make it into the final draft that you might want to share? Interesting bits of information or history that you thought might be cool to include, but wasn't ultimately a part of your narrative?
So I think, I mean, the history of surgery, whenever like the topic had first come up, trying to write even a 2,500 word piece about the history of all surgery felt pretty daunting. Um, and so I had to be like really deliberate about cutting things down as much as possible. I think some of the things that I came across while I was writing that I wasn't able to include, but really would have loved to talk about more, uh, include the. So I mentioned this story of one of the surgeons who instructs, I think, some of the other people in the OR during an abdominal surgery to urinate in the open abdomen. The idea being that urine could be used antiseptically. And the same surgeon also, there's a probably more famous story of him um, witnessing someone's nose get cut off. And so first he urinates on the nose to clean it off. And then only after that does he reattach it to the person's face. I mean, if you can imagine being that patient, having your doctor pee on your nose, just no longer attached to your face before attaching it once more. I mean, I think that's a pretty startling idea to grapple with. Um, but at the same time, I think it's really important for us to remember that we can't always approach these stories from the past with like our modern understanding. Um, and we have to be really humble about like how uncertain knowledge is, especially as new medical advances are happening every day. I also think with Sir Harold Gillies, it's really important to, like Dr. Gillies was a pioneer, specifically within facial plastic surgery, but also he was a pioneer in ushering forth like some methods that really influenced how we handle sex reassignment surgery. It talks about it in the Facemaker as well, but I believe Dr. Gillies was one of the first people to perform like a phalloplasty, so like a construction of a penis for a trans man. And I mean, that is pretty revolutionary. Unfortunately, the word limit prevented me from actually talking about that and doing it justice. I would say the third thing that I really wanted to focus more on was the various groups that have been like marginalized or taken advantage of throughout surgery's development. And because I think increasingly we need to make that part of the story, recognize the sacrifices and abuses that were done to or taken from or put on all these different people. The instance of the OBGYN who specifically experimented on Black women. But there are much longer uh, anecdotes and analyses of that. And so I really recommend reading Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington for that topic if you'd like to see a much more in-depth and really like very well recognized as being a solid analysis of a lot of the issues.
I wonder what that surgeon did using urine as an antiseptic when he couldn't actually urinate. Like, did he have bags of urine around just in case it was needed? I guess in that anecdote you mentioned in the story, he also had his students participate. So just in case there wasn't enough to sterilize the area.
Yeah, relying on more supply. I can't be
Right.
imagined. I can't imagine being asked as a student to do that nowadays. But I suppose, I mean, even relatively recently, med students had a lot more asked of them in terms of like being frequently the subjects of medical experiments. So maybe this is somewhat an extension of that.
Is there anything that comes to mind at all if you think about things that the medical profession does that is akin to that? Probably not as shocking and flagrant as urinating on patients, but is there anything that is akin to that old practice of relying on urine to sterilize surgery that happens today? Anything that comes to mind as something that in the future the medical profession will perhaps abandon?
I think in general, the process of trying to practice evidence based medicine is really difficult. Um, Mostly because you have to go through the process of saying which evidence is good enough to make you say, all right, this is how we're going to approach actually treating people, often in harrowing situations. I think recently there's been a lot more questioning as to how much like vitamin C and vitamin D supplementation actually, impact people's health. And so I'd probably argue like supplementation is one area where we're doing more questioning of some of the previous teaching. And I think there's also been concern about some studies in the past that maybe, maybe deserve to be questioned a little bit more than they were at the beginning. I think recently there was this large investigation by some journalists at Science into some Alzheimer's research. Specifically, a couple researchers were uh, there was evidence of them possibly doctoring results within an extensive number of studies, some of which were used as like the foundation for our research into like beta amyloid proteins as a possible cause of Alzheimer's disease. I would say in the surgical setting, there are so many routines that we do nowadays, and probably we need to be really diligent about making sure that each activity that we do has a purpose. And there's nothing that comes to mind that would be on the same level as urinating in a patient's open abdomen. Um, but I would say we need to be really cognizant of if we're doing an action, it should have evidence behind it. If it doesn't have evidence behind it, why is it there? Why are we wasting our time on it? It could possibly be harmful. And that iterative process of questioning each activity that we have that's involved in our daily practice, I think is super important for making sure that we're constantly like narrowing the gap between where we are and some, idealized version of like optimal care.
What are you up to at the moment, writing wise or just in your studies?
Sure. Well, I just got back from a 2-week medical ethics fellowship in Germany and Poland. It's run by the Fellowships at Auschwitz for the Society of Professional Ethics, otherwise known as FASPE, FASPE. And specifically, the program was centered around bringing together members of different professions to go to Germany and Poland to specifically ask how their professions were involved in perpetrating the atrocities of the Holocaust. It was quite an emotionally heavy experience at times, but I am super grateful for, one, the opportunity, but two, the group of people that I was with was absolutely incredible. The way the program works is that I was traveling with a group of people from medicine, from journalism, and then also seminarians as well. And so having discussions of, the press and religious understanding mixed in with a lot of what I'm exposed to more of the medical talk, I thought was really educational and thought-provoking. I'm still trying to process all of the experiences that I had, but it was quite humbling to have to encounter every single day the reality that the Holocaust did happen, and it didn't just suddenly come into existence. It happened because many people made choices, including people who have similar amounts of power that I do now, or were in positions of power that like I will come into someday. Um, and yeah, coming to terms with the reality of that was quite difficult and is still quite difficult. But I think it's super critical for us to ask that of ourselves. Like, what decisions were made back then? What kinds of justifications were used to, make people feel better about the acts of complicity that they were involved in? And also sometimes, like, what small acts of rebellion did people take? And looking at that mixture of, where there were opportunities for rebellion and where there were opportunities for complicity, because often it's like somewhere, like the reality lies somewhere within like the spectrum between those two. um, I think is really important. I'm super interested in medical ethics in general, and so that's what inspired me to go on the trip. And I have some really great mentors here at Columbia who are involved in that. And so since I think I sent the first draft of the piece right as I was leaving at Newark Airport for this trip. So since coming back, and I'm currently involved in a research year doing research within ENT, actually, which was the specialty of Dr. Harold Gillies, the subject of the facemaker. So that's what's been taking up my time recently. I absolutely am hoping to write again soon. My hand is already itching for the pen.
I hope you do. Maybe you could write about your reflections on that trip. That sounds fascinating. To close us off, Michael, do you want to tell our viewers where they can find your work, if you have a website or if you're on Twitter?
Sure. Yeah, you can find my work specifically just by going to my Twitter. I usually share everything on there. I believe my handle is Michael W. Denham. And I would love to, field any questions, or if people want to reach out and talk more about something they think I would be interested in, or if you found any of my work interesting and want to talk more, I am always open to discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. Appreciate you giving us your time.
Thank you so much. It was a real privilege to talk with you today, Brian.